I mentioned how that the Black Death, we left off with the Black Death. The Black Death wound up though being beneficial to a lot of Europeans, and it forced wages up. And one of my students, it might have been this guy, did a paper on the Black Death, maybe a couple of you, that it forced wages to go up as nobles would try to steal each other's workers by offering the other man's workers a higher wage to become a work for him. And this meant that the nobility got less and less of the pie, while the common people got a bigger share of the pie. Now, prices began to be regulated, and then I'm not saying this is good. We had a president many years ago who regulated wages and prices, and the result was it flopped. Richard Milhouse Nixon by name. And of course, he had a 90-day wage price freeze, but the problem with that is wages are often prices, and prices are often wages, and it's hard to distinguish and separate between the two. But nevertheless, a lot of governments have felt like they had to keep prices down. Well, I mean, talking about inflation. Inflation was a big problem in the late 1970s. But here's the other side of that. Supposing in 1911 the government had fixed the price of automobiles. Can you imagine every time you want to start your car getting out and cranking it up?
Cranking?
Oh yeah, you used to start your cars by cranking. Oh yes, the old cars. Some of them. They were still putting out cranked cars until 1934. The point I'm making, folk, is as we improve, we have to charge more money. I mean, today's cars are better by far than cars used to be, but you're not cheaper. Today's medicine is far more effective than the medicine was 40 and 50 years ago, but it is not cheap. Believe me, but it's not at all cheap. But again, inflation is part of progress. You get better, put out a better product. Sometimes the better product costs less. And this, like in a case of the price of computers keeps going down, and the price of computer parts keep going down, but then they get better as they go down. But that's not always the rule. Sometimes better means more expensive. Now, this takes us up to the 100 Years' War. All right. Basically, it lasts 100 years. The 100 Years' War was fought between England and France, with England on one side. Now, there were several causes. I mean, when I was in high school, we had to learn many and numerous causes. Economic was one of them, but a lot of the problem was the English kings still held a lot of land in France. You know, your English kings since the days of Henry II were vassals to the King of France. That includes Richard and John and Edward I and on down. They were vassals to the King of France, but they also intermarried in such a way that they related to the throne of the King of France. Now, I mean, they're related to the King of France. I said, but they're related to the King of France. Well, make a long story short, the Capetian line of French kings finally became vacant one day when King Philip the Fair. Philip the Fair had 3 sons, and when he died, the throne went to the oldest. The oldest died without a child. The second one died without a child, and the third one did. The 3 sons ruled for 18 years, one after another, I mean, approximately 6 years apiece, and they all 3 died without children. When the third one died, the throne of France was vacant. Well, the King of England says, I am the rightful heir to the throne of France. He claimed the French throne. And he had some justification for it because of intermarriages between the royal lines. He had some justification for it, but the people of France said, no, we're going to pick our own king. So they picked someone who was related to the royal line, had blue blood in his veins, but he was not the King of England. So the King of England went to war to claim the French throne. The war was destined to last 100 years. Now, That's not to say they continuously fought for 100 years. No, I mean, the 100 Years' War makes it sound like, but they at least twice went 20 years with no fighting. At least 2, maybe 3 times. They would fight. Now, the 100 Years' War is credited with changing warfare in a lot of ways. Number one, gunpowder was used. Gunpowder had been invented by the Chinese. Its use had been taught to the Mongolians. Then the Muslim world picked it up, and then the Europeans picked it up. And instead of using it like the Chinese did as grenades, where they throw the, well, I call it grenade for lack of a better word, but they throw the device at the enemy, they learned how to make cannon and shoot cannonballs. Gunpowder was to do a lot to make armored knights obsolete, because the knight in armor could not stand up to gunpowder, or could not stand up to a cannonball. In addition, the English began using the longbow. Longbow was 6 foot long, and it could shoot an arrow so hard to penetrate armor, and also the crossbow was used. The crossbow was so thick of a bow that it had to be cocked by a lever. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, a few of you, yeah. Okay, now again, if you go to an archery school, you'll see crossbows. They still have to be cocked by a lever because a ordinary man just can't cock one back. But when they shoot, 2 things about the shot. Number one, it's straight, almost like as straight as a bullet. And number 2, it hits a person or hits the animal it's shot at very, very hard. It could penetrate shield and armor both. And between the longbow, the crossbow, and the cannon, the armored knight was about to become obsolete. In fact, he eventually became obsolete.
Mr. Cunningham?
Yes, yeah.
This term blue blood,
Yeah.
isn't that a result of intermarriage and hemophilia?
Question.
But no, wait, no, okay, yeah. It's all, okay, there's 2 meanings to that term. Number 1, blue blood, but number 2, it also has to do with royalty.
Well, I know that.
So it's a second.
But the origin of that word, wasn't that?
I really honestly don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I'm using the term because I've seen it printed up in books. It means, it isn't, the way I'm using the term, it has to do with if you're descended from royalty to where you can claim a throne if the throne becomes vacant.
Right, but I thought the term originated because of when people
Royalty.
intermarry, then hemophilia was one of the
It was a real
offshoots
problem.
of marrying too close to the same family.
The last Tsarevich of Russia
And-
was a hemophiliac.
And when there was the bluish blood when they would get cut, because hemophiliacs are bleeders.
Yeah.
So that's where I
Again, I
thought
don't
it came from.
know. The way I'm using the term, though, and hopefully all of you understood that, is royal blood.
Yeah.
Royalty. In other words, if you had royalty. Again, the King of England believed that he was related, it's close enough to the King of France that he should have the throne. So they went to war over the issue. Now keep in mind, throughout the war, the French outnumbered the English by more than 4 to 1. And yet the English won most of the battles. And we'll talk about why in a few minutes, well, largely because the English had better weapons. And the French were fighting the old-fashioned way with knights in armor, and the English were fighting the new way with long bows and crossbows. And both sides had the cannon. But the French were relying more on their knights than the English were, armored knights. Now, the king's name, by the way, was Edward III. Don't worry about that so much. But now, the foot soldier was destined to become more and more important, particularly the pikeman. All right, now, you might think the pike is not all that useful, but a pike is another term for spear. Well, basically, a pike was shaped. Now, again, the ones I'm drawing is, which meant that you could thrust it out, or you could get the man with a back stroke also. You know, thrust him and get him with a front stroke, or get him with a back stroke if you didn't get him with a front stroke. So it was like a two-way spear. The pikeman, what made him so effective was the pikeman lined up shoulder to shoulder. And that would even terrify an armored knight, because the pikeman could kill the horse or at least wound a horse so bad the horse would turn around and run. So the pikeman, basically what it amounts to is the common man, your man of low birth, became more and more important as your men of noble birth became less and less important on a battlefield. Now, for a couple of battles, the only one I'm going to mention, though, is the Battle of Crécy. At the Battle of Crécy, the French knights simply galloped into the battlefield. They did not line up in formation like they had in the days of Charles Martel. They just simply, no planning, just up and at them, and they rushed pell-mell toward the English longbowmen, the English crossbowmen, the English pikemen. But a rainstorm had occurred. In fact, it was raining pretty heavily while the Battle of Crécy was going on. A lot of the horses slipped in the mud. By this time, the armor the knights were wearing was so heavy that a lot of knights became deformed after a few years of wearing it. But also, it is said that if a knight fell down, it took 5 men to get him back up. And a lot of knights smothered to death in their armor. They fell, so that the horse would fall, and they'd be wounded and could not get up, and their armor would keep them from breathing. And this was one reason that eventually soldiers quit wearing armor. Now, I want to jump ahead to, in the Gulf War, I've heard there's a certain kind of bulletproof equipment that soldiers can wear that will stop today's bullets, but steel armor or iron armor is not used anymore on the battlefield, owing to the fact that it will not stop today's bullets. Anyway, at the Battle of Crécy, the French knights, a lot of them slipped in the mud. Then they were hit by a hail of arrows shot from crossbows and longbows. The arrows would penetrate the shields and armor of the knights. The Battle of Crécy was a big victory for the English, and it did a lot to make the English think that they could win. Well, make a long story short, after many years had passed, by the way, there were a couple other battles like this, the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Agincourt. These battles were won by the English. But then occurred another one of their 20-year truces. King Charles VI, I'm not going to write his name now, but King Charles VI went on a hunting trip one day with the nobles, and some insane, folk, I'm going to tell you that the rest of the story is going to involve some stuff that some people would think is supernatural. I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm just going to tell it in raw format, and each of you can make up your mind what you believe. But some insane man came out of the woods and touched the person of the king, and the king himself went insane. He killed one of the knights who was sitting close to him, and he just went completely crazy. He was to remain this way the rest of his life. He was to live another 30 years. For at least 2 years, he was out of insanity. Basically, he was in and out of insanity. The people that day, they called in exorcists, they called in witches, they called in any way that they could. They called in priests, anything they could to try to fix Charles VI. But Charles VI wouldn't fix. Well, 10 years into this, 10 years into this insanity, Charles VI signed a will in which he said, when I die, I'm going to give my throne to the King of England, and that was supposed to end the war. So Charles VI was to live out his life, and when he died, the crown was to go to the king. Now, getting tongue-tied. The crown was to go to the King of England. Now, if any of you know anything about wills, the sanity of the person who makes the will, the person who makes will have to be of sound mind. And even as long ago as the late 1300s and the early 1400s, if a person was considered insane when he made out the will, his will could be contested. Shortly after Charles VI made this will, his wife bore a son who eventually became Charles VII. Now, if you notice the way I worded that, I said shortly after Charles VI made out his will, his wife bore a son. we do not know for sure who the father of Charles VII was. Now, I mean, since his mother was the queen, of course, they assumed, and since she was married, of course, to the king, they assumed that his father was the madman Charles VI. But the wife, the queen, once told a confidant that Charles VI is impotent. Well, any of you know anything about impotent? Impotence can be intermittent. It can, a man might be impotent for a few days, a few months, and then not be impotent again. Fact of the matter is, if we ever dug them both up, we might could determine whether or not Charles VII was really the son of Charles VI or not. But Charles VII even doubted his own parentage. Well, we don't know. But anyway, Charles VII grew up, and when Charles VII was about 20 years old, his father, Charles VII, his supposed father, Charles VI, died. The King of England said, okay, according to this document, the will I should have the throne. The people of France said no, the king was insane, which he really was. He didn't know what he was doing. The will is invalid. And we're going to make Charles VII king. So the English went on a rampage and started attacking. And it appeared that they were winning. Charles VII did not have himself crowned because he was a very indecisive man, whatever else he was. He could not come to firm decisions, and a lot of the problem was he doubted his own parentage. He really doubted that he had any right to the throne. So, all he could do was sit. He couldn't even get to his palace easily because the English controlled so much of what was going on. Well, all right, so things looked really gloomy for France at this time. Even though I've already told you, the French outnumbered the English 4-1. What France needed was someone to instill the French people with a little bit of patriotism, and this person finally came on the scene in the form of a young woman named Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc lived on the edge of France, on the border between France and Germany. Lived in a town called Domremy, like Domremy, Fosso, but lived in Domremy, France. As a girl of 10, Joan became really, really concerned about the French, and she continually prayed, "Oh Lord, save France. Oh Lord, save France." Then she started to hear voices. Now, folk, I've had more than one student do papers on Joan of Arc, and one of them said that it was obvious to her that Joan of Arc was suffering from epilepsy, and that therefore what Joan needed was medicine, and the right kind of medicine could have, not cured, but kept in check Joan's epilepsy. And just like they say that Alexander the Great was suffering from epilepsy because he believed Zeus was his father, and Julius Caesar was suffering from epilepsy because he couldn't believe the reports that he got from both one of his wives and from this soothsayer that he was going to be killed in the middle of March, and so on and so forth. Well, Joan of Arc was looked on by a lot of persons being epileptic. Believe what you will. Again, folk, to me, if you believe she was epileptic, you have to explain how epilepsy could influence her to lead an army. Basically, she went to the local nobleman. Now, it has been said it was not unheard of for young girls to go to the local nobleman to discuss the issues. So when she went to this local nobleman's throne, his name was Sir Robert Beaumains, don't worry about the names of it. Sir Robert listened to her first, then laughed at her. Basically what she said was, "Sir Robert, God has sent me to go lead France to victory over the English." Well, she was laughed out of the court at first. Her father was very embarrassed. Her father gave her a good whipping, and for a time her voices stopped. The voices, by the way, came from Michael the Archangel and St. Catherine and St. Margaret. St. Catherine and St. Margaret are two saints you don't hear much today, but they were very important in the life of Joanne. Anyway, but the voices came back after time, and they told her, go to lead on. Yes?
Who was the saints again?
What's that?
Saint Margaret.
St. Catherine and St. Margaret. Don't worry about the name. No, you can look it up. St. Catherine, there were two saints that had lived about 1,000 years before. Very important at their time, but saints that we largely forget about today. Anyway, now folk, here's the part of the story that we're missing. Joanne kept going back to Sir Robert, and somehow Sir Robert decided to listen to her. And then, now, you might ask, how could a nobleman be persuaded? And this we don't know, but there are some interesting theories. And one of the theories is that Joanne really was not the daughter of this peasant family, that Joanne was really an illegitimate daughter of Charles VI, and therefore she was really Charles VII's half-brother. This theory has been advanced, by the way. I don't know if any of you heard of it. Therefore, that is why she was so concerned, and also might explain, well, she comes across to me as being a highly intelligent woman. Yes?
So you said Joan of Arc had epilepsy, supposedly. What were the other historical figures you said might have it?
Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, oh yeah, Socrates. I couldn't think of his name. Socrates, because he claimed to be buddies with a demon, and claimed the demons talking to him. So Socrates, okay, yeah, Socrates.
Oh, Socrates was the one that said he had demons talking in his ear.
Yeah, the demons would whisper things into his ear and keep him morally upright. Yeah, Socrates. Now, again, the subject of epilepsy is a whole different subject all in itself. All right, anyway,
And have fun doing it.
now, but whatever, the word of Joanne got around. The word began to spread through all of France that there's some woman who's interested in saving France. Anyway, Sir Robert wound up sending Joanne to the king with a bunch of his he picked his best troops. In those days, all nobility had their own private little army. So he picked his best troops. They slept and hid away in the daytime and traveled only at night, so they would be under cover of darkness. To this day, if you visit eastern France, there are a lot of people who will say, my ancestor hid Joan of Arc away while she was on her way to see the king. A lot of people still are proud of that fact. But anyway, Joanne went to see the king. And, all right, some of this story is difficult to explain if you just believe in purely natural phenomena. When Joanne approached the castle, one of the guards made fun of her. She said to him, you ought to be careful what you say because your death is near. Within an hour, that guard was dead. Now the king, whatever else he might have been, he was somewhat of an intelligent man. He looked around the room, knowing this peasant girl was going to come in, and he looked around the room and picked a lackey who was about his size, said, lackey, you and me step over here in this adjacent room and switch clothes. So the king and the lackey switched clothes. The lackey came out wearing a crown on his head and the scepter, and he sat on the throne with his royal robes, which normally would have been a crime to impersonate the king, but this time the king had ordered it. The king sat in he stood in lackey clothes and stood with a tray, ready to serve people. They were going to make a dunce out of Joanne. Joanne walked into the room and she ignored the lackey sitting on the throne with a crown on his head and the royal robes. She looked around the room and saw this lackey, went down, bowed down. The lackey was, the king who was dressed as lackey, Joan, what are you doing obeisance to me for? Because she said, you're the Dauphin. She refused to call him king because he had not been crowned. She called him Dauphin. You've heard that story. She kept calling Dauphin until he finally was crowned. Now, if you don't know anything about French royalty, the Dauphin was the heir apparent, or the heir to the throne, the next in line for the throne. So she would only call him Dauphin. Anyway, the whole court, by the way, and this was done in front of the most educated people in Europe. All the court could do was applaud. This display of whatever you call it, either wisdom or otherworldliness. And of course, some people think that the king and Joanne had seen each other before because Joanne was the king's half-brother. But again, this story is told, a whole bunch of stories are told. It's hard to tell at this point what to believe. The king, who was indecisive, did not know what to do. For one thing, outside of his palace, an army was assembling. He was getting volunteers pouring into his army from all over the realm, and he knew, and everybody knew, and to this day we know, Joanne was the only reason. The one thing she actually did, that even her critics give her credit, she supplied the French people with a sense of patriotism. She'd go to fire under the French and told them, hey, we can win this thing. And a lot of them started to believe it. Anyway, The king sent her to one priest after another to have her examined. They wanted to determine, well, the issue was, is she a witch or is she a saint? Is she a saint? Is she a witch? And the priest examined her to see if she were a virgin. The priest decided finally she was. The priest asked her all kinds of questions, and if you really want to go into detail, you can look at the questions they asked her and the answers she gave. And the answers she gave was the answers that almost seemed that they were answers that were revealed from another world, like otherworldly answers. But she gave extremely, extremely wise answers. And finally, the priest told the king, "We don't know what to make of her, but you're the king, you've got to make a decision." And the king finally did the unthinkable. He gave his army to be led by this woman. Now, the last time I researched this, I heard that Joanne really did not actually lead the army. She sat in all the top level. When the top level commanders met, she was at least at the meetings. Now, how much orders she gave and how much bossing around she did, we don't know. We do know this Joanne of Arc had two problems, as far as I'm concerned, two big problems. Number one, she was a cross-dresser, transvestite. She wore men's clothing, boys' clothes. She wore boys' clothes, and she was extremely domineering. Very bossy. And each of you take that for whatever you will. But anyway, she was finally given command of the army. And the idea, first battle she fought was to lift the siege of Orleans. The British had surrounded Orleans.
I'm sorry, run that back. You said what?
What's that?
What were you saying about?
She was going to lift the siege,
transvestite?
I used the word lift the siege of Orleans. Does that answer your question? You know, Orleans was a city in France where the British had besieged.
No,
And
I'm talking about what were you saying about transvestite?
oh, she wore boys'
So
clothes.
she was a transvestite?
She was a transvestite.
According
She
to
wore
their
boys'
definition?
clothes. Instead of wearing women's clothes, she wore boys' clothes. Again, each of you can decide for yourself what you think of it. Anyway, she lived at the siege of Orleans. The English shot arrows at the army, and one of the arrows hit Joanne in the breast, and Joanne was very weakened and stabbed with pain and carried off to the battlefield. But she learned while she was in a pain condition that the British had rallied and they were winning. So she got back up from her bed in spite of her pain, in spite of her wound, and went out and rallied the French troops, got the French troops to turn from their run and turn the tide of battle, and won the battle. And the siege of Orleans was lifted. So victory number one went to Joanne. The British became so afraid of it, one British commander refused to fight her. All told, make a long story short, she won 4 battles where she was at least had the title of head of the army. And in all 4 cases, we know that she attended all the meetings when the top brass met, the generals and the colonels and whatever. She was there at the meeting. Well, again, we don't know how much part she took in the meetings, but she was, and she might have actually been directing the show. Hard to say. But she won 4 battles, and any king who has won 4 battles in a row will begin to feel more confidence in himself. Charles VII was no exception. He began to strut around his palace with a lot more self-confidence, and he felt like, hey, at this point I can have myself crowned. So the king went to Reims, as our kings had been doing for hundreds of years, went to Reims and had himself crowned, and this was where Joanne was at her height. The king bowed the knee with his wife at his right and Joanne at his left. There's been some famous paintings made. Joanne was in some very pale armor, that everybody else thought was gray, but she insisted was white. And there she stood while the king and queen were being crowned. This was the height. Then the story takes on a different turn. She insisted that they go straight for Paris and take Paris next. The king and his generals insisted, now wait a minute, now we're not ready to take on Paris yet. Now, several years later they did get Paris, but the king and his generals said, no, not yet. Joanne said they went, and of course Joanne even told the king what to do at this point. She had a lot of confidence in herself, more so than the king. So basically, she started to collect her army and go take Paris, but on their way there, the French captured her, and the Burgundians, they were French, but they sided with the English. The Burgundians turned her over to the English. She was tried for witchcraft. The trial lasted on and off for a year, during which time Joanne's voices largely stopped. They would come for a while. Joanne said later, during this time, that maybe she'd gotten too proud and that God hated her pride, that she'd gotten too confident in herself, and she should have listened to the advice of the king and his generals who said, we're not ready to take on Paris yet. Whatever the case, Joanne at one point broke down and recanted and denounced her voices and said she hadn't heard them and hoped for forgiveness in the next life. But then she turned around and repented of her recantation. Said, I did hear them. God has spoken to me. Joanne also insisted that God could deal with everyone directly without going through priestly mediators. Something that if she had been Islamic, the Islamic people would have had no trouble with, because the Islamic people do believe that you can go to God directly without priestly mediators. The Catholic Church said, no, you must go to God through a priest. And again, some people have called her the first modern woman. She was an independent thinker, that much she was. But to make a long story short, the English burned her at the stake for witchcraft. But as soon as they'd done it, they realized her mistake. And later, when the English captured Napoleon, they wouldn't kill him because they felt like they made a mistake with Joanne. All right, jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Joanne's father died 2 years later of a broken heart, mostly grieving over his daughter. But Joanne's family was given a title of nobility and exempted from taxes for 300 years. In those days, noblemen didn't pay taxes, so Joanne's family became somewhat wealthy, and her family became a celebrity. And finally, Joanne's mother requested that the king write a letter to the Pope to overturn Joanne's conviction. Well, the Pope listened to the case, and the Pope overturned all the charges against Joanne that were made by clergy who were deceased already. In other words, but the clergy who were still alive, the Pope did not overturn their decisions. Well, a few years went by, and of course most popes are up in years. The average pope lasted about 6 years in those days, sometimes less than that. But anyway, a few years went by, that pope died, a new pope came in, but by that time all the clergy who condemned Joanne were dead. The king was asked by Joanne's mother to send a letter to this new pope requesting that Joanne's case be retried. The new pope completely exonerated Joanne of all charges of witchcraft and restored her into full status with the church. Centuries went by. In 1920, World War I was over, and the Catholic Church felt like they needed someone that they could look up to kind of put Europe back together again. So they made Joanne a saint. So today she's called Saint Joan of Arc. Her day, all saints have a day, her day is May 30th, and any of you are old enough to remember May 30th used to be Memorial Day before Nixon changed it to Monday. But today, Memorial Day is the last Monday. It always falls on Monday. But in those days, it used to fall on May the 30th, and we'd get off school on May 30th. It was our last school holiday. Now, the big question is, why did the King of France choose to not give any assistance to Joanne while she was in prison? And folk, I think that the answer is that she was so domineering that he just didn't feel like he was in charge as long as she was around. No, that he just felt like that she bossed him around, and that he felt like, hey, who is she? And I'm of possibly blue blood and royal blood, and she's a commoner. Now, there is a story too that Joanne was secretly exchanged, and another young girl who really was a witch was put in her place in the prison, and this other young girl was the one whom they burned at the stake. Be that as it may, and Joanne lived for a good many years, married and had a few children of her own. That story is also told. Again, it depends, folk, on who you read and when you read it. The official account, though, is that she was burned at the stake. The year was 1431. I don't worry about the years so much, except for me it's important because in 52 years later, Martin Luther was born. The world was about to make some really, really good big changes, And a lot of it, the Protestant Reformation revolved around the theology of Joanne, and that Joanne believed, as do Protestant Christians, the priesthood of all believers. Every believer was his own priest and could go directly to God and did not need a priestly mediator. And also, you could do your own thinking independent of the church. And I had a Muslim woman ask me a few years back, well, what would happen if a lot of Islam converted to Christianity? I said you'd find among 10 former Muslims, 12 different opinions. One of them would say we need to worship Mary, another one would say, no, we shouldn't worship Mary. Another one would say, we shouldn't go to movies. Notice how it's okay to go to movies. One of them would say we should not drink Coca-Colas because they're bad for you. I mean, there's some merit to this. Another one would say we shouldn't play cards because it's addictive, and another one would say it's okay to play cards, and I'm not addicted to it, so on and so forth. And they get to argue about all this stuff, and some of you know what I'm talking about, I guess. Maybe some of you don't. But you get to argue about all these different questions. Nevertheless, folk, independent thinking is what it was to take to help Europe burst out of its borders and overspread the whole globe, when people began to feel like, hey, we can be free of the shackles of the church has placed us under. In a few years, Copernicus was to say that the earth was not the center of the universe. And a few years later, Martin Luther was to declare that we should believe in justification by faith and whatever. And in other words, Joan of Arc was somewhat of a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation.